First off, you're going to peel and stick your stick and stitch pattern into the centre of your garment. And then if you'd like to add an initial, you can draw this on either with a heat erasable or a water soluble marker. Now if adding an initial, you're going to use chain stitch. So pull your yarn through the garment, leaving a little tail on the back. Hold to one side with your thumb, put the needle a stitch length ahead. So with your thumb, stitch length ahead, and then the yarn should naturally loop over the needle. So hold to one side, needle through the same hole, stitch length ahead, and that little loop is just hooked around. Stitch length ahead, and then as you can see, just by holding that yarn to the side, it's enabling you to create a little natural loop, which creates the little loop in the chain. Just continue this same motion of needle through the same hole, stitch length ahead, hook the yarn round in a little loop, so hold to the side, same hole, and then pull that tight, and then a single little anchor stitch to finish off. And then with the little remnants on the back, we're doing a whipped back stitch. So you're just threading that leftover yarn through the inside of your garment, through the chain stitch that's come through. And that just ties off any loose ends and stops it unravelling, and then cut off any excess. And for the carrot, we're going to use satin stitch. Now this is a really simple stitch. You bring your yarn up through one side, always leaving that little tail. Then you thread the needle in a straight line through the opposite end of the carrot. So you're going up through the right, down through the left, up through the right, down through the left. And you're going to continue this at the whole length of the shape, ensuring that each stitch is as close as possible to the previous stitch. So you don't want to see any of the fabric coming through. So down through the left, up through the right, down through the left. And you don't want to pull the yarn too tight because that can lead to puckering, but you want it just enough so the yarn lies flat to the fabric. Repeat this process all the way to the top of the shape. And your final stitch, and then on the inside of the garment, I'm threading the end of yarn through to meet that first bit of yarn, and then just tying them in a little knot to secure and cutting off any excess. The leaves, we're going to do lazy daisy stitch. So bring the needle up through the fabric, again leaving that little tail. Pop the needle through the same hole and bring it up to the end of the leaf and hook it over. and then a little anchor stitch to keep that in place. So needle up through the bottom of the leaf, hold to the side through the same hole up through the top, wrap it round in a little loop, very, very similar process to chain stitch, and then that little stitch to anchor it into place. One more time, so needle up through the bottom, through the same hole, and then bring it up through the top, hook the yarn round, and just that final little stitch to anchor it into place. And then again, you're going to bring the end of the yarn to meet the start of the yarn and tie it off. And we're going to use the same embroidery stitch as we did with the carrot for the seed of the avocado. So again, we're going to do satin stitch. So bring the needle up through the right hand side of the shape and down through the left. Again, just continuing this pattern, ensuring that each stitch is as close to the last one as it can be until the whole seed has been filled. Just as we did with the initial at the start, we're going to use chain stitch for the avocado fruit. So bring the yarn through, hold to one side, needle through the same hole. You're just hooking that yarn around in a little loop of the chain. So needle through the same hole, stitch length ahead, and that yarn will naturally form a loop if you're holding it to the side with your thumb. Now, starting first of all with a little ring around the stone in the centre of the avocado, and then we're going to move out to fill the rest of the shape. Just going to continue working in little lines until all of the shape has been filled. So I'm just using a single little stitch here to end that line, bringing the needle up through again, moving the fabric so I'm always stitching away from me. Then we're going to do another little line just to fill these last gaps once we've done those rings of chain stitch. So then just a little anchor stitch to hold that line down. And then I'm just filling that last little bit of space there with a couple of individual straight stitches until the whole shape has been filled. And now for the skin of the avocado, we're going to do one ring of back stitch, so a single stitch, and then bring the needle up a stitch length ahead and bring the yarn to the end of your previous stitch, so a stitch length ahead and then to the end of your previous stitch. stitch length ahead, and then bring the yarn back on itself to the end of your previous stitch. You're just going to do one ring around the whole of the avocado. You're just going to continue going until you come back to meet that first bit of yarn where you started. So one more stitch to meet the end of your last stitch, and then a final little stitch to finish off. And then you can just tie off the start and the end of the darker green yarn together. And again, just cut off any excess. Now for the broccoli stalk, we're going to use a series of long and short stitches. So what you want is just individual straight stitches, but you want them all in varying length. So starting with a little line of stitches along the bottom of the stalk. So as you can see, that stitch was a little bit longer. I'll do one now just a little bit shorter. And what you want is for the stitches to just run in parallel with the one previous, but all different lengths. That just creates a really seamless finish and stops it looking too blocky. And you just continue alternating stitch lengths along the bottom of the broccoli stalk. One final individual stitch here, and then you're going to come down from the top into the middle, just weaving all those stitches in amongst each other until all of the stalk has been filled. Again, just ensuring that it's individual straight stitches, but each one a slightly different length from the one previous. Now for the broccoli head, this is slightly time consuming, but we're going to do lots of individual French knots. Now a little hack is to keep that tail of yarn on the surface of your fabric, just so it doesn't get tangled when you're doing all these knots. So you bring the yarn through, wrap it round the needle twice, and poke the needle back down through the same hole, creating a little knot. So bring the needle up through the fabric, hold the yarn in your non-needle hand, wrap it away from you around the needle twice, and then down through the same hole. So bring the needle up through the fabric, hold the yarn in your non-needle hand, wrap it around the needle twice, and then down through the same hole. And you're going to continue doing lots of individual knots till the whole of the broccoli head has been filled. As you're coming to the end, you just do those last few little knots, one final one, wrap it round twice, needle through, and then what you can do is for that initial tail of yarn, you can pull that back through and you can tie it off. But by leaving it on the front of the fabric to start with, it stops it getting tangled in the back as you're doing the multiple knots, and then just cut off the excess. And for the beetroot, we're going to do exactly the same as we did for the initial and for the avocado. And we're going to do chain stitch to fill the shape. So again here we're working with the outer ring first, then you're going to work your way in. So needle through the same hole, a stitch length ahead, loop the yarn round, and then just pull the yarn through. And you're just going to continue doing this in circular motions around the outside of the shape and working your way in until the whole shape is filled. As you can see, I always like to be stitching away from me. That's just my own personal preference. So I'll always just be moving the fabric around. So I'm always pushing the needle in and pushing that away from me. So here, just moving the fabric again, needle through the same hole into another link of your chain. And then you can do another one. And again, just moving that fabric round. And then I've done another little ring, a little anchor stitch to hold that ring down. And then we're going through for one final little ring of chain stitch to complete the little purple bit of the beetroot. And for the leaves, we're going to do fishbone stitch. So you're going to do one individual stitch down the central line of the leaf, and then bring the needle up through one side of the leaf and down into the centre to the end of where that first stitch was, and up through the opposite side, and then back down through that central line. You continue doing this, just alternating sides. So here, up through the right and down through the centre, and then up through the left and down through the centre. And you continue doing that from the top to the bottom of the leaf. the purple yarn, the same as we used for the beetroot. Just do a couple of little individual stitches down the central line of the leaf using back stitch. So stitch length ahead and the needle to meet the end of the last stitch. It's just 3 or 4 of those down that central line of the leaf. And lastly, for the corn, you're going to do split stitch until you get to the little heads of corn. So an individual straight stitch, very similar to back stitch here, but we're going to pierce the middle of the previous stitch with the needle, so splitting the stitch. You could also just do back stitch as well. So another straight stitch, just pop the needle through the middle of the previous stitch, and then lazy daisy for the individual little bits of corn. Just pull the needle through, down through the same hole and up to the end, and then a little anchor stitch. So needle through the start of the piece of corn, needle through the same hole, you're just creating a little loop, needle through the end, hook the loop over and pop a little stitch to secure it. And then an individual stitch here, just down that central line again. And then you do another piece of corn, so needle through the start of the corn, through the same hole, then create that little loop. And you're just going to continue doing this along the whole length of the piece of corn. So again, a little loop, needle through the end and hook the loop over. Last few, just that little loop and that little anchor stitch to hook it into place. So needle through the same hole to create a loop, needle through the end of the piece of corn, and then anchor it into place. And there you have it. And then to tie off the ends, as we've done previously, you want to bring that end piece of yarn through to the initial piece of yarn, and we just do this by weaving the yarn through the stitches on the inside of the garment until the 2 pieces of yarn meet each other, and tie off the ends, and then just cut off any excess. And then I place my garment in a wool wash on a low temperature to get rid of the paper.